if something is wrong, we're going to justify the reason we did it in a way that makes us look as good as possible. And unfortunately, that's the cognitive bias of how our brains work.
So, Derek, I've never watched one of these big-ass trials. I never watched, back in the day, O.J. Simpson. I never watched any of the Amber Heard, Johnny Depp trials. I think it's a total distraction. And I have to admit, I was totally transfixed with the entire Alex Jones proceedings recently, right from the depositions. There's a podcast called Knowledge Fight, which does an amazing job of breaking down Alex Jones's litany of hate, lies, and disinformation. And I was just so thrilled to see him get that judgment of like $48 million, give or take, against the two parents of one child. And I just can't wait for him to be taken apart. So I know your bailiwick is conspirituality, not straight up conspiracism, but what's your take on the Alex Jones trial?
I think Alex Jones makes a perfect test run for conspirituality, actually, because he is the right-wing provocateur who made millions of dollars making people feel bad about their bodies and that they weren't strong enough. Supplements, vitamins, that's how he made a lot of his empire was from that. And that involved psychologically priming people for the idea that they're not healthy and fit enough to survive what was coming. Now, from the wellness aspect, it's different in the sense that the place you're going is somewhere usually of transcendence and beauty, whereas with Alex Jones, it's somewhere very warlike.
Yeah.
But the crossover of actually selling this, what leads to body fascism in some ways, but begins with the idea that you're not strong or capable enough and that these things will prepare you for what's coming. That's the conspirituality playbook. So you can very much look at an Alex Jones and get to a Joe Rogan and then get to the whole field of players that we cover on conspirituality very easily. The most disheartening aspect of the trial, because I'm the same way, I don't watch trials. And not that I watch this one, but I have a bunch of friends on Twitter who are covering it at moment by moment. And I did tap in for some of the clips. It was really disheartening watching him be a little puppy dog, scolded by the judge, and then go on InfoWars and talk.
They're already guilty, Alex Jones. They're told 3 times a day that they're not allowed to find me not guilty. How am I even supposed to defend myself? Motherfucker. The trial has already happened. You've already been determined guilty. You decided not to attend that trial. This is the damages trial. Like, the amount of, like, even there, just that you'd think that that'd be fairly important when you're saying, I'm sorry, obviously I'm pretty worked up about this, but you'd think that'd be fairly important to point out to your listeners, like, hey, I've already been found guilty and I can't now retroactively defend myself to declare myself not guilty in this trial that I've decided to attend.
What I'm wondering is if you're a follower of him and you see his affect during the trial, and anytime he got worked up, the judge immediately shut it down. And some of her comments about being like, you know, truth is not your opinions to that effect. If you see that and the way he's acting, how do you take seriously the caricature he plays on his podcast? Because, and this happens over and over with a lot of these figures, when they actually are in danger of getting in trouble, they kowtow, they completely melt because they're not used to not owning the environment they're operating in. And when they're in those situations, and that's really, you can argue, where someone's character is going to shine or not. So I don't care, like, we're in my home office right now, and I feel very comfortable in this domain, but my character is really going to be when I'm out in the world in a situation where I'm not in my environment. How am I acting there? In here, I can act however I want, make people believe whatever I want, but that doesn't matter. So when it's shown who I really am out in the world, that's how I would base how I judge someone's character. So I don't understand how all of these followers and people who are probably donating to him right now to help with that, alleviate some of that. I think it was 49.2 million was final for everything. How are they giving him money knowing that's his character?
I would like to think, here's what I would like to think, given the undeniable facts that he has a following. I'd like to think that 90% of the people who follow him are following him for shits and giggles, for laughs. He's hilarious. And he's right once in a while, this whole Joe Rogan shtick. And that only a small percentage of people believe in the actual, pedophile demon gods who are, jumping between dimensions and keeping children in the basement of pizza parlors that don't actually have basements. But where's that money coming from? Like, he's making a ton of dough. What was it, like $70, $80 million a year was InfoWars' income. He regularly gets Bitcoin donation. Oh, here's $1 million. Here's $8 million. So people are either totally buy it or they think that he's spreading enough disinformation out there to continue funding it.
Well, first, to go with where the money's coming from, again, some of that at least is coming from his downline on his supplement sales and everything he sells there and hawks there. I have a very, I'll say, nuanced view of cryptocurrency because I work full-time in crypto. I very much believe in the technology and certain ideas behind it, but the space is corrupted as well. And so, unfortunately, because of the anonymity that it provides for people, you will get people who are probably behind a lot of right-wing PACs and funding think tanks who are also helping promote his cause because he's very useful to them. And we don't know. And that lack of transparency is a downside of the current environment that we're living in right now.
Mm-hmm. See, I in my world where only 10% of his followers actually believe everything he says, which I don't actually know is true anymore. But let's assume that for a second. I think he still serves a very useful purpose for the wild conspiracy crowd because he moves the Overton window, right? The window of what is you're allowed to discuss in public without being a complete kook. By being ultra kooky, he moves the goalposts. So now people might go, okay, there probably aren't interdimensional aliens smuggling children to a base in the moon where the pedophiles come and visit them. But, let's just take one. Let's say he's right about 1/5 of that. Then we're left with Pizzagate, essentially. One or 3-dimensional Pizzagate or 4 dimensions. We're not smuggling children to the moon anymore. And just by being so crazy, yet having enough connections to people like Steve Bannon and Donald Trump. Even Donald Trump was on InfoWars in 2015, I think. It just begins to shift the window of what people think is plausible towards a much, much more conspiratorial view of the world.
And within that 90%, because, again, I work in the crypto space, which in a lot of ways leans libertarian. It's not exclusively there, but it does. And from people that I know in these spaces, they don't pay as much attention to detail as you do or Conspirituality does. So I see on Twitter a lot, people are like, even now, even today, what happened to Christian Northrup? And then people are tagging Conspirituality because we've been on that beat for 2 years following her.
So for the people who don't know, who is Christian Northrup and what happened to her?
She's a pretty well-known obstetrician who in the 1990s wrote a very popular book on women's health and was always on the alt-med side of things. But over the years, and especially since the pandemic, has gone full conspiracy theorist, like well beyond Conspirituality. Like, we often talk about how we don't know the intent of the influencers. Do they really believe this, or are they just trying to monetize it, or are they trying to find out what's working for their business? Like, it's hard to tell. We don't make that call. She's made it very easy because she is calling for full-arm armed revolts, and now she now calls her gatherings in Maine like church. Like, she is full-on not even prosperity theology, like Christian nationalist theology. She has moved in that direction and made it explicit. So watching this grandmotherly figure who's well known for women's health and still puts out videos where she's playing the harp on her backyard in Maine. Very nice.
That's wholesome.
House. And then the next one, she's calling for armed revolt. Like, so she's not hiding it. So that's who she is. So that's someone who, if you read her book, and maybe you know about her a little bit, And maybe you followed her, but you don't pay that much attention. And occasionally you see something on herbs that she posts about. And you're like, oh, she's great, whatever. And then you see her talking about the pedophiles who run the government. Like, wait, where did this come from? And that's what I find. Alex Jones, I feel like it's very hard not to consume his content and not realize who he is. Like, he's always made it apparent. But with a lot of the figures, they kind of try to play the middle with things. And then once in a while they go over and you find out who they really are. But if you're not paying close attention, like people who work in this space do, then I think there is a sizable amount of people who follow, but not that closely. And there's always that line to me of, when do I stop paying attention to them at all? Because I was a fan of Joe Rogan for years.
Same here.
And at some point I was just like, I can't take anything you're doing seriously now. We talked about this before on the podcast. I still like Sam Harris. I like Bill Maher. I don't agree with everything. Bill Maher's views on COVID and masking are ludicrous to me, but I still like a lot of what he says. But someone like Alex Jones, having been in one of the trade centers within an hour before the first plane struck, and having lived through that experience in my life, when he came out as a truther and really pushed that, because that predates Sandy Hook, at that moment, I was like, how can anyone take him seriously? And then when Rogan had him on and was like, oh, well, this is 5-6 years ago. Oh, he's kooky, but he's my friend. Even then I was like, that's the truther guy. And then the Sandy Hook guy. And I'm like, I can't take that seriously at all. And the sort of indoctrination window into these mindsets, it's a very hard thing to grapple with, especially if you're just more of a passive fan who just consumes sometimes.
I know some of the people who follow him are like, they're undecided as to whether, and we're going to get off of Alex Jones. I can't do any more of his purple bloated, super healthy face yelling and screaming. But I know people who are deep in the conspiracy rabbit hole who still wonder. They hedge their bets by saying, we don't know if he's the official opposition. We don't know if he's actually funded by the government to make the rest of us conspiracy theorists look bad. So that's an out. You can follow the dude, but then when he says something really kooky, you go, maybe I never really believed him. I always thought he was a government agent just trying to make the rest of us serious conspiracy theorists look bad. Have you run into that? It's a conspiracy about the conspiracy guy. Yes.
And that's how our brains work. Like, we'll always try to justify our decisions. And people coming clean with being wrong, unfortunately to me, people have a very hard time with it. It's something, actually, for this week's episode, we're working on traditional Chinese medicine in America. And let's just say in the process, I still have questions about certain things, but I've learned. And I point out where I'm wrong on certain things, or where I've changed my mind on certain things. And I think that's a very healthy relationship to have. But the thing is, that's not our default mode. Our default mode is protectionism. We want to protect our sense of identity at all costs. And so if something is wrong, we're going to justify the reason we did it in a way that makes us look as good as possible. And unfortunately, that's the cognitive bias of how our brains work. So it's very hard, especially in online environments where people take people's opinions that shouldn't ever matter to them way too seriously. And that can make them scramble into their corner and fight even harder. So in these spaces, trying to get people who are honest about being wrong is very difficult. And we can make enormous leaps of imagination in order to justify things when they don't go out as we thought they would.
Mm-hmm. So before we go on, so you said this week's episode, that's on Conspirituality Podcast. Yes. Can we just define for the people who may not be familiar with this, what conspirituality is versus straight up wild conspiracy theory, which is how we started. Alex Jones, straight up wild, yes. The embodiment of conspiracy theory.
Well, conspiracy theories are the con in conspirituality. So conspirituality, the term that was coined in 2011, represents the crossover of the predominantly left-leaning wellness space, people who are into alt-med, yoga, meditation, holistic lifestyles, with the right-wing conspiratorial mindsets. So the last time historically we really went through a period like this was in the mid to late 1960s, when you had the back to the earth hippie movement working with John Birch Society, fluoride in the water is going to kill you. Mm-hmm. And that sort of merging, even though the coin wasn't termed then, this idea of right-wing wellness people has always existed. At least I've traced it back at least 200 years. You can find it in America. And in fact, I was talking to a friend the other day, and his girlfriend's mother is a complete, I live in Oregon now. She's down in Oregon in a smaller city, complete back to the land hippie who will not stop talking about her guns and how no one's going to take it from her, and yet will drop LSD and be with everyone. And so this, I don't think in the American imagination as presented through movies and the media, we've really grappled with the disparities, but I think that mindset has always existed in certain populations. And in times of stress, it comes to the surface because both sides are anti-establishment. And so that's where they end up fusing in some manner, because there are power structures that are trying to stop you or hold you back or take advantage of you, and you're fighting against them. And that usually has to do with some sort of conspiracy theory going on, which also involves sometimes taking actual very real problems with government or governmental agencies or power structures, but then just taking it to a degree that is often ludicrous.
Yeah, I'm not the person who thought of this, the horseshoe metaphor, but if you think of left to right as a political spectrum, a straight line, what in the last couple of years, you've taken the two ends of that line and you've bent them together into a horseshoe, so that left, far, far left and far, far right are just a tiny distance apart from each other. And I wonder if you could quantify that. Like, I agree in the 60s, you had that, and maybe the legacy of like good old boys flying the Confederate flag with 15 guns per person per house, but they're pot smokers. maybe that's the legacy of the 60s and 70s, pot smoking right-wing Confederates. And now we're seeing it like again in an extreme version. Do you think it's more extreme now than it was then?
It's hard to tell. I often think about that because, well, the top layer of what we're dealing with is climate change, right? We're sitting here and I had to close everything in my office. There's no AC on right now. It's 100 degrees.
But you're on the Pacific Northwest. It's supposed to be not hot here in the summer.
Yeah. This is the third record-breaking weekend in Portland this summer, and I just moved here. So I'm experiencing it firsthand, as a lot of people are. So you have this added layer of we are destroying the environment, which pushes everything up a level. That said...
And manifests itself in increased prices for food, right? Like it manifests itself in climactic refugees, and it's not just, everything's getting hotter. This has roots that affect our day-to-day lives in ways that we don't even think about. I mean, just wait until India, Pakistan, and China start fighting over the water coming out of the Himalayas. Like, that'll make the Ukraine-Russia conflict look like a pushing match compared to an axe fight, because now you have 3 countries that have got nuclear weapons. Anyhow, I'm just, it's more than it's just getting hot. It all of a sudden those avocados can't get grown anymore. All of a sudden, the price of wheat, we lost this wheat crop because it was too hot, or there's no water left. You can make a strong argument that a large part of the civil wars in places like Syria are being driven by price of increasing bread. Now you get the government fighting the people, because people have, how many revolutions have been started by increases in prices in bread, and then you end up getting refugees going all across the world. So it's sorry, that was my rant on.
Well, you mentioned the problems with resources and supply chains, but another effect of increased heat is increased emotional valence toward agitation and violence. Yeah. So that's been shown before too, like the famous incident of 77 or 78 in New York City, when the power shut down and it was 100 degrees and there was so much violence because people when you're in that, so when you're in an environment that's physically uncomfortable to what you're used to, so emotion, the word means to move away from. When you're moving away from a baseline state or homeostasis, that is going to result in an emotional valence. And when hot tends to bring out violence. So that's also a very real effect that we have to grapple with. It's
hard to think of too many midwinter riots in the on the midwinter East Coast. I can't. You think of the Watts riot. Were the Rodney King riots? That was in the summer, wasn't it? But
yes, it was.
That's Los Angeles.
Yes,
but it would have been hotter then. I never thought about that before, but I think you're absolutely right.
Yes. Yeah. So there was actually a study done, or a study covered by Mother Jones 10, 12 years ago now. And I really remember this one, of showing how if the rest of the world tried to use the amount of resources that Americans use on a daily basis, like middle class Americans, whatever exists of that the world could not supply enough resources, and showing how climate change was going to impact those resources. And that's where the study on violence came up, and they showed historical data points of different points of really heat waves, and then violence coinciding with it.
So we're about, just for context, for people who might be listening to this in the future, I'm Canadian, so I follow American politics. I mean, you guys, are the meth lab downstairs in our apartment building. And you guys just passed a climate change bill. You got the midterms like 100 days out. And watching from afar, but kind of fascinated, can't turn away, kind of watching, I'm just seeing the conspiracy and conspiratorial beliefs becoming part of the Republican mainstream, and people running almost entirely on wild conspiracy theories. I guess the biggest one would be the, stop the steal. The 2020 elections were stolen. You're more tied into this, being both American and doing this full time. How are you seeing conspiracy and conspirituality infiltrate the political situation in the States? Yeah.
Well, remember our podcast, we did allow a resident Canadian in on it. And so I know a little about your fine country. We've been tracking how the conspirituality ideologies are going to affect the midterms and maybe the 2024 election. And interestingly, we had a clearer line on it, but the last 2 weeks in America, a lot has happened really quick. And I am critical of Democrats, as I think you should be. I'm actually independent, but I will lean left always. So that is the party that, votes I vote my interest there. And there has been a good focus on actionable items that are being passed now, which is something new to us. We haven't had this for a while, unfortunately. So it will interest me how the conspiritualists do influence voting. Now, the biggest topic has been anti-vax. That's something that is what the inception of the Conspirituality Podcast represented, because it was pandemic that made me reach out to Mathew and Julian to start the podcast, start talking about it.
Pandemic, that awful documentary with triple air quotes by Mickey Willis.
Yes, correct. But it's not just anti-vax. It's this idea of medical freedom, which then translates into bodily sovereignty. And again, that's where you get that horseshoe you were talking about of the right and the left. This is my body. This is my choice, except if it's abortion. But it's always this idea of ultimate individualistic freedom that unites these sides. So anti-vax is sort of a pipeline into this idea of full and total sovereignty. Of course, until your power grid fails, and then you're looking at the government and like, what are you doing? And that's why I find a lot of these ideologies laughable in some ways. I've seen a number of conspiritualists over these couple years we've done the podcast, when they get COVID, they will not admit they have COVID, or they won't admit the symptoms, or they're like, oh, it's something else in my life. One influencer we cover actually said this. I covered it at the time. He got COVID, and then he ate something with sugar on it, and he swore that it was the sugar that made him have really bad symptoms. But again, we talked a moment ago about justifying your ideology, and that's what they have to, those are the leaps they have to go through in order to justify those things. And so you have this strong idea of freedom that exists within these people. And that, I think, even if it's not specifically anti-vax, because by the midterms, it's sort of dying down. And then by 2024, unless some other pandemic happens, it'll probably be a lot quieter. But what translated was this idea of I always know what's best for me. And that is the end of the horseshoe. And that is where they will leave their mark. And my question is whether or not they'll have enough political influence to make a dent. Now they have big enough followings where if some of the main influencers say, I'm voting for this person, you'll get people just blindly following that. So I do think it will have some impact on where the elections go.
Okay. So here we're talking conspirituality.
Yes.
What about straight up conspiracy?
Watching CPAC, which just happened. Now, my name is Hungarian. I'm predominantly
Well, you must have been thrilled to have Victor Urban as the guest of honor. He's a...
So my family, my grandparents all came from either Russia, Hungary, and Poland, and all surrounding regions of Poland. But that's kind of, where all my family's from. So I've spent my entire life, most people mispronounce my last name, it's fine. I don't even say it how you would in Hungary. But the idea, the culture, people don't know Eastern European culture in America generally. They don't know the music, they don't know the food, they don't know anything about it. So I was always like, when I was a world music journalist, I'd cover Balkan music a lot. I'd always have ways of being like, hey, there's some cool stuff over here to check out. Never would I imagine that this is how Hungary gets on the world stage. And so I'm watching Orban saying that the American military and the Hungarian military should unite because obviously that would benefit him. But even that mindset going into CPAC where you have on the floor of the convention center, you have a fake inmate who was a January 6th insurrectionist in a cage and then Christian ministers praying over him. And this is the mindset of what people are looking at. And this is, a very powerful voting bloc in America. There's no ceiling anymore. Like there are so many things as a writer that I've thought of in the past. I wrote a novella years ago that was, I thought, politically reaching. And now I look at it and I'm like, this is the tamest shit imaginable in reflection of where they've gone with their ideas. And it just doesn't matter anymore. Whatever they say, they will just run with.
I honestly, half the time, cannot tell irony from reality. I cannot tell satire from reality, and I have to check because no matter how satirical the idea is, it's like, no, this person's actually saying this, or this is actually somebody's election platform. But for me, I think the peak CPAC was the golden idol of Donald Trump. Was that 1 or 2 years ago when they had like the big golden statue of predominantly Christian conservatives who should know their Bible, who should know that in the Old Testament, you shouldn't pray to giant golden idols. And they had a giant golden idol of Trump in the hallway there. Like that I mean, at that point, you couldn't make this shit up.
I grew up with the Trump family. I mean, going to Atlantic City when I was young, and being in that environment. I've mentioned this before, but Ivanka was my yoga student in New York City. Like, not that I had close ties with the family, but they were around my orbit whether on TV or in person. Mm-hmm. And my whole life, they were never taken seriously when you're from there, from Jersey, New York, tri-state area. You always knew they were charlatans and grifters. Like, that wasn't even in question. So when The Apprentice happened and the fact that people took him seriously, I was like, and I kind of just paid peripheral attention. I was like, what? They really? But in my mind, it was just like, well, he's a blubbering idiot. So they're attracted to him because he's not really that strong, but he's just presenting like that. And then when he actually won, I realized how wrong and how blind I am to certain things and the way that the influence that affect has on people. So that has always been very challenging to me, to think that anyone took him seriously at any point. And the fact that it persists and it has defined one of the two political parties in this country is why we're the meth lab in your basement.
Yeah. It's been said that, we value expertise, and we value expertise differentially. Like most people will say, oh, this guy's a doctor, so he must know more about medicine than I do. Disregarding what's happened the last 2 years. I saw Joe Rogan post on Instagram, I'm going to do what he does. I'm going to follow Dr. Rogan as opposed to this guy who spent 7 years becoming an internal medicine specialist. But we have experts, but we trust celebrities more than experts. And that's why you get celebrities to endorse life insurance. You get celebrities to endorse, Viagra or whatever it is. But there's a level beyond that, and that's the celebrity expert. And Donald Trump, not only is he a celebrity, he's also an expert. Look at The Apprentice. He's an expert businessman, and he's a celebrity. So it's hard to think of a better example of the celebrity expert, again, air quotes a million times, than the former guy.
There's a real level of trust that occurs over these forms of communication. I've had people reach out to me on the podcast, being like, I feel like I know you. And I'm like, cool. I get that because I felt that too with people. But I'm always like, don't take that as real. Because what's happened is some people have really liked some things and then they heard something that I said that they didn't agree with. And then it's like
gutted.
Yeah, it's like just hating, like leaves Patreon, talk shit on Instagram, like all this stuff. And I'm like, Ricky Gervais in his new special did a great job where he's explaining like what he knew was going to be people coming at him for his jokes on trans people. And he said, you might agree with 19 of the 20 things I say tonight, but that one thing, you're going to hang me for that. And I don't know anyone in my life that I agree with 100%. And I hope no one agrees with me 100%, because that doesn't make for very good relationships. There's no tension there to work with. And so when you're in these situations where you have some trust of people, television in this case, we're talking about Trump, but any sort of medium, Rogan being this, and you develop a sense of trust, then if you're willing to just take everything they say at face value, that's a very dangerous place to be. And that's how people get manipulated. Well,
there's that term parasociality, where, the classic example, I guess, would be something like the Instagram to OnlyFans funnel, right? Like you see some girl and she's there and she's in a tight top and she's doing a little dance and, being funny and sexy. So you would hypothetically, it's never happened to me, but friends of mine, develop kind of a relationship with her, a seemingly social relationship. And next thing you know, you're again, never happened to me, but friends of mine, paying $10 a month or $20 a month to see her boobs. So the parasociality there, and when you think of how one would create these sort of social relationships, something like podcasting is an incredibly powerful medium, especially if you're prolific and especially if they're long form. Because now you could actually have Joe Rogan in your head for 3 to 4 hours almost every day of just the new stuff, forget the old stuff. And when somebody's in your head and they're talking to you, and you're just a fly on the wall, you're at the bar and there's Joe talking to, I don't know, Brett Weinstein. It's like you're hanging out with them. Oh, now you're vacuuming, but you're listening to Joe. And now you're driving, but you're listening to Joe. Now you're on the treadmill, but you're listening to Joe. Now you're shopping, but you're listening to Joe. I think it's quite, somehow it's different from watching somebody on television. Television is this altar. Oh, they're on television. They must be a somebody. But who watches television anymore, first of all? And this just being in someone's ear for hours and hours and hours, a week or even a day, I think that's an incredibly powerful way to really feel like they really like you. Doggone it, they really like you, and they have your best interest at heart.
And as someone who consumed hundreds of hours of him years ago, I have always... What lent itself to the success of Conspirituality, I believe, is the fact that the three of us, in our own ways, were always critical of the industries we were in, at least for a while. Like, we were all fully into different things. Like, Mathew's been honest. He's been in 2 cults. Julian has kind of been in one. I've never been in a cult, but I was much more into the metaphysics of yoga for a while. And But at some point, we all had our breaking points where we left and started saying, wait, this isn't right. And especially as someone, I'm working on, besides the Conspirituality book we have a deal for, I've just started working on my own book, which is going to focus on male body dysmorphia, because I grew up overweight and I had an eating disorder. And these sorts of spaces aren't talked about by men very much. But then I looked at the wellness community at some point, and this idea of bodily purity and this perfect body that you can achieve. And over time, having dealt with my eating disorder, I was like, this is so damaging to people. And so I was really ready for the moment when the wellness community went off the rails, because I had a history with it. I forgot where we started the question.
No, there was...
well, because I wanted to tie it back, but I lost that one.
You've given me a new one, which is, do you remember the breaking point? Do you remember the point at which you said,
yes.
What was it?
Okay, so I got to the point where I was vegan and I was vegetarian. I was pescatarian for 10 years, vegetarian for 10 years, and vegan for 2 of those years. But at the veganism stage, it was very much about more orthorexia, which is the eating disorder, where you're always looking for the purest foods. So it wasn't just vegan.
Has that knife that's been used to cut the carrots, was that previously in the fish?
No,
not quite that bad.
I never got that bad. It was,
well, then you weren't perfect enough.
It was more like, are these carrots organic?
Oh, okay.
Like that was I'm sure people do what you said. Having lived in New York for so long and eating on a number of grills, you kind of have to suspend your disbelief at some point with some of it. So along with that, what was happening in my body is I was having a lot of bad GI problems. I suffered from anxiety disorder for a long time, and then I had these really bad outbreaks of canker sores, and these things that were long-standing in my body. And then I actually listened to 2 people that I wouldn't listen to today, but I listened to their podcasts. One was Dave Asprey and one was Mark Siskind. And exactly how I feel now. But on the same week, unrelated podcasts, I heard them talking about paleo diets and how they had very similar problems to what I was going through and how these diets worked with them. So I went from veganism to paleo, and I have to say that not from paleo, because I'm not an advocate of that diet, but when I became a carnivore again and I stopped stressing out about the food and I started eating a variety of foods, I haven't had a panic disorder. All of my GI problems cleared up, and canker sores are very rare now. And that was the breaking point, because I realized I was beholden to this ideology of perfection that I was chasing through my body that was damaging my body. Since I changed my diet and like I said, I eat healthy, I try to eat as well as I can, but I eat everything. I feel better in my body. And it's been like 7 years now. And all of those problems I suffered for so long are gone. And I'm like, okay, so what am I really doing this for? If I want to live a healthy lifestyle, I should feel good in my body. And I do now. But when I was like, again, going along these certain tracks, and if veganism works for you, great. Like I am not against diets, but it's that mindset of this diet is the only way that will get me to something that I think is very crippling. And that is how so much of the wellness industry operates and how they monetize people's fears about their bodies.
Well, it's also interesting that a lot of cults, they always classically try to control a couple of things. They always try to control your sexuality. Either have sex with a leader, don't have sex at all, only have sex in this position. We got to control. It doesn't really matter what we're controlling, but we're going to control something.
Yes.
And number 2, they often try to control the diet. That's maybe not as universal, but certainly there are tons of Christian sects. There's tons of Eastern religions or Eastern cults that, from macrobiotics through to, I'm trying to pick another great example.
Nightshades, like don't eat nightshades. Yeah, that's one.
Where the control, it doesn't really matter what we control, but you can't be trusted to put things in your own body. It has to come from the grand poobah of the religion. It has to come from the sacred text. Yeah. And and ultimately, as you kind of point out, it ends up making you feel bad about yourself because you're not doing it pure enough. Maybe the reason you had that canker sore outbreak or that anxiety attack was because you ate an inorganic carrot, and somehow they slipped one in.
Yes, that wasn't. Oh, I mean, it's something it's in my family I've dealt with, but there were times where I got so neurotic about food it set off a panic attack. So it wasn't the only factor. And honestly, I only switched diets for the GI issues. The panic and the canker sores were actually byproducts of it. I did not expect to be attending to those. And it just happened that when I kind of took a holistic approach to my body in a different way, it cleared up all of those other things. The third factor, though, sleep. So sex, food, sleep. Those are the three dominant control factors of cults.
I mean, obviously, if you're in some extreme Buddhist religion, you're getting up at 3 a.m. to do your mantras. How else is sleep controlled?
A lot of times what they'll do in, especially introductory workshops, this is very common of like a week, is that they'll limit your sleep for the first few nights so that you're so disoriented that they can then start to manipulate your emotions. So it's that classical like break you down and then build you back up, but we're building you up to listen to us. And sleep is a very important component of that.
Actually, I watched so there's a guy called Aubry Marcus. Well known for being the developer of the Fleshlight and the earlier sponsor of the Joe Rogan.
He wasn't a developer.
Wasn't he?
No. His mother's husband made it.
Okay. But he ran On It when On It was mostly selling.
So he was involved with the advertising of it.
Okay.
On like Rogan and such.
Okay.
But yeah, his mother, who's a former tennis player, married the guy who invented the Fleshlight.
Okay. And then they pivoted to, nootropics and, alpha brain and all this stuff.
So Aubrey's first company was nail polish, and it was advertised
Alpha Nail
to get you laid because colors would attract women. When he pivoted to supplements, the first one was a supplement that instantly cured your hangover. So Alpha Brain comes out of a hangover cure. That's where it started.
So thank you for correcting me.
He's one of the main people I've personally covered because I think he's such an egregious offender in so many ways. And he likes to play. He's a trust fund kid that likes to play shaman. Yeah. And it just really bothers me how manipulative his business model is.
He was the inspiration for when I spent way too many hours photoshopping the Shaman Fest 2021 thing and put that on my Instagram, and I'm still very proud of that. I want to get that printed out in large. But anyhow, so he recently had this Arcadia music festival / personal development. But I do wonder if the sleep deprivation was part of that. It says this music festival, personal development, where you apparently have to be incredibly good looking to attend and promise not to wear very much. Or at least that's the people they film. And it's incredibly expensive for a music festival.
So interesting series of events. I found out about Arcadia, and I produced probably over 100 shows in my life between one-off nights to actual 3-day festivals. Yeah. So
not podcast shows, music shows.
Yes, music shows, DJs, artists, like visual artists. Like I from college on, I was producing shows. So that was very much part of my life. I've probably lost way more money than I made over those years, but like it's something I love being behind festivals and shows. And so I know a lot about the business of festivals specifically. And when I saw Arcadia that you had to apply to be in fit for service to then pay for the festival, I wrote a whole Substack on it, breaking down a lot of the elements, like the fact that they're data mining questions like, what are your biggest fears? Yeah. Now, if you want to go see some mission play, why are you going to tell a for-profit company your biggest fears? Like, what's going on there? So I wrote a Substack. The following week, Aubry sent out a newsletter directly, without naming me, directly addressing what I had written. And because he won't name me, I don't really care about that. But like, there's been a few times where we've created stuff, called him out on stuff, and from what I understand from people in his circle, he doesn't like being called out. He wants to be the center of attention. But it's a very real issue to me. So interestingly, right after that Substack in his newsletter, he ended up making Arcadia donation-based. I'm going to guess because tickets weren't selling. Because it was $1,100 to travel to, was it Montana or Wyoming somehow. The same year Burning Man's going back after years. So you have to remember, he's taking the Burning Man artists And he's taken a bunch of those, and he's trying to do a festival a month before a very expensive festival is going on, and expecting crowds to go to it, which is insane. Like, people don't have that kind of money. And your instinct about the pretty people on Instagram, from what I've heard, is probably correct as well. And there's just a real cult-like energy in Austin right now. And this was sort of a landmark event. And in the industry, we call it papering. Like, when I did my last big, large-scale festival in Santa Monica, we lost about $400,000 of our investors' money. And so we ended up papering the event by giving away a number of tickets so that at least more people came for the performers and the yoga instructors. And we actually ended up having a very good crowd, but because we absorbed the cost of those tickets.
So it's social proof to not be embarrassed, and it's maybe promotion for the next year.
Yes, exactly. And there wasn't a next one of that, but yes, that is exactly it. And if you look at Arcadia and you look at the crowds from what I could see on Instagram, I would not imagine that he sold very many tickets.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about his resident philosopher, the Charles Eisenstein? He's again beginning to pop up in all these same circuits. You know, when you recognize these players, and man, is it an incestuous little world. And here I am. I've been on your podcast. You've been on my podcast before. So it's a little incestuous world.
Yes.
We're making a few $1 million a year less than they are.
Yeah, I'll say that. What's interesting about Charles, and I'll always give him credit, because we have criticized a number of people on our podcast, and he was the only one to come on to discuss and have a 2-part interview with Mathew. So Mathew knows more about, we all have people we cover. I happen to cover Aubry more than the other two guys, but Mathew really focused on Charles. And I think it was a good interview. I really credit him for that. But I don't know his path. Working in finance and looking at his take on sacred economics, I do question some of his more popular works, which was based on that. Besides that, though, he ended up writing on his blog a piece that kind of crossed over into what could be considered anti-Semitic. Now, whether or not it is debatable, and I'm not going to call it that. He is Jewish, so like there's a lot going on here. But it was enough to make his publisher say that we're going to take all of our profits from all of his books moving forward and give it to Anti-Defamation League, like organizations that help fight anti-Semitism. So that's a pretty strong stance. Do
you remember what it was? Was it like the standard ranting about the, quote, leftist billionaires, by which we really mean George Soros?
No, it was... I don't remember if there was any of that, but specifically, it had to do with saying vaccine mandates were leading toward Nazism.
Okay. Including
photos of like Hitler-era stuff going on the post. So that really... and. Again, we're so privileged in this country we do have real problems, but the problems that conspiracy theories identify and then go with as the road to indoctrination are so absurd. And the ideas behind like the idea that all of the stuff with the vaccines, the microchips to the digital IDs to all of this, it's so ridiculous. But at that point, he lost a good amount of his crowd. People were like, this is too far. His publisher did that. And he kind of disappeared. He wrote another blog after that, defending himself. Didn't see him for a little while. The next place you see him, sitting across from Robbie Marcus.
The Oprah apology tour without actually apologizing in his space.
Yes. And then all of a sudden he was in on this crowd. Now, as I said, from what I've heard from some people in Austin, he wasn't really well looked upon before, and then somehow he was brought into the circle. So I don't know how all that happened. I don't know the politics of that, but that seems to have been the transition, and all of a sudden now he's in it. And supposedly the reason that Fit for Service became donation-based is because of Charles's Sacred Economics, like his book and then his work on that. So now he is very tied into that scene. He spoke at Arcadia, and his philosophy is what ended up driving this organization that Aubry Marcus runs to be donation-based. So he is somehow entwined in that community now. And one thing you'll know very quickly about influencers is they go where the attention is, sometimes where the money is. That's not always the case, but sometimes where the money is, but they always go where the attention is.
So we probably should have done this first. I mean, it's easy to sort of lampoon Aubrey Marcus. He first came to my attention because of the connection with Joe Rogan. But what's the problem with Aubrey Marcus? We've done some the fleshlight. I brought that up intentionally because it's bloody funny. Now you've got a shaman who's was there, and this insanely expensive Burning Man ripoff. But he's just trying to make a buck. What's the problem with that, Derek? What's the problem with Aubry?
Well, from a business perspective, so you know a little bit of the background, the alpha nails, and then the fleshlight, and the whole that whole lineage. But Alpha Brain, okay, so
Alpha Brain, the number one selling supplement,
yes,
from On It.
Yes.
Often promoted by Joe Rogan. Man, I couldn't do this podcast without my Alpha Brain.
It helps me write better sentences.
Yeah.
But scientifically proven to improve memory. That was the selling point.
Yeah.
Go read the study. You can find it on PubMed. The study is 63 people, which would be a pilot study.
Yeah.
Should really be a pilot study, which is fine. That's how you start to research things. Then you go to hundreds, then you go to thousands and tens of thousands, and then you can say it's scientifically proven. So 63 people.
There's nothing.
Look at the 6 or 7 people who studied it. 2 of them, consultants for On It Labs. So the conflict of interest is right there.
Whoops, let me just delete that entire line from the Excel spreadsheet.
But it's in the study. You have to, and they did put it, but you have to see that, and it's right there. But now you're asking people, so you talked about parasociality before. I remember Rogan promoting it. I almost bought it at that time. I'm just not a supplement guy. But I was at that time like, oh, does this really work? I wasn't paying attention. I didn't read the study back then. How many of the listeners are going and reading the study to find that? No, Joe Rogan is a co-founder of On It. So they own it together. They sold it to Unilever for reportedly in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So here you have, and I just did this on our Instagram last week, where I have Aubrey Marcus talking about science being fixed, science being real, science being the only thing we should pay attention to, ironically, because he was talking about vaccines. Oh. So he was doing the whole science is fit, and I did a whole thing where I ended up quoting Richard Feynman.
So he was doing it, but he was in context. He's saying the exact opposite.
Exactly. He was interviewing Cully Brogan, and I found this.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So I found this clip of it, and I was just like, and I said in the video that I made, you didn't have a problem with science when it proved your supplement works. Now here's the other aspect about the supplement. So we covered his real mother, his birth mother, marrying the founder of the Fleshlight. His father made a ton of money in the 1970s in oil money. So that's where I don't know what he got or if he got, but I'm guessing, I'm speculating on that, but he comes from oil money. And his father ended up marrying a woman named Janet Zand. Janet Zand is an acupuncturist and homeopathist. She has lozenges that you can buy at any CVS. They're very famous. They don't do anything, but because they're homeopathic. But she is created one of the most successful homeopathic companies in America. She formulated Alpha Brain. So you have a homeopathist, which we know if there's a pseudoscience that exists, that is it, formulating a supplement that goes on to be promoted by Rogan, and through that downline ends up being sold to Unilever, a company with a horrible environmental track record, for a lot of money. So from a business perspective, that's where I have the problem. The personal perspective, no, I don't know him. I know nothing about him. I don't really care. And that's the thing about this space is like on a personal level, if I'm sitting across from someone, I want to know about your ideas and what you're saying. Like I'm going to criticize those. But as a person, I don't really know anything about them. But when I see someone with that background who's out there being like pro-sovereignty, anti-vax, vocally anti-vax, but then liking the science when it proves what is in his interests, and then I see him playing shaman, like I said, up leading these retreats in the desert where they're doing all face paint, Maori-like, and doing these tribal songs and all of this. And then I listen to what he says on his podcast. There's nothing authentic that I can take away from any of that.
So obviously you're immersed in this, probably much too much for your own health. But What are your predictions for the future? What trends do you see coming up here in the next, especially as we get closer to the midterms? Like, I did see the anti-vax thing coming when COVID broke. That is a successful prediction I made. I don't really know what comes next. I don't know what the next, what are some candidates for people we're going to start seeing or bad ideas that are going to start spreading? So I would just go back to the litany of conspiracy stuff and pick something old and revitalize it?
Well, let's start with something good. I was really taken aback when Kansas voted by 18 points in favor of keeping abortion. I'm optimistically saying, wow, we might have actually had too much overreach. And that is going to take care of a lot of, because we have so many single issue voters in this country, if that's what helps keep Democrats in power a little longer and actually not only keeps them in power, because I have, like I said, my criticism of Democrats, but stops some of the noise we're experiencing to help people focus on what matters, I'm going to take that as a victory. So that felt good. So we're in a moment of optimism right now.
I will note that being tied in with the jiu-jitsu and MMA space, there's a whole, as we talked about on your podcast, there's a whole MAGA, right-wing, alt-right conspiracy movement within that space. But a lot of them were dead silent about Roe versus Wade, and a couple of them even spoke out against it. Like people that I thought were just automatically going, yeah, get rid of Roe versus Wade. Because it turns out that, say, famous MMA fighters don't want to pay child support. Right? Like that's my interpretation, right? They're coasting on their fame. They're capitalizing on it in the dating and mating market. And man, they don't want to, like, what do you mean if I have sex without a condom that she's going to be able to hit me up for child support because I can't guilt her into having an abortion? It was crickets. I'm sure I might have missed one. I can't think of one big name guy who was busy like yelling about stop the steal or vaccine mandates say something positive in the Roe versus Wade getting struck down.
I heard a lot of silence in the conspirituality realm. There were people like J.P. Sears that were, he calls it nuance, that went hard right on that. To be fair, I did watch his video on it, and he ultimately said that he thinks that women have the right to choose, but everything else was they should never have to, basically. They should always just, so that was sort of where he landed. I have seen in the conspirituality space a number of women be very happy with the verdict because it's sacred. So I think it's a very interesting angle you're taking from MMA. I think from the wellness perspective, this whole sacredness of life helped them to feel good with that decision. So I did see some of that, but I would say it was mostly crickets as well over here.
I think it represents that this is the victory of the evangelical space, the Christian evangelicals, who are, of course, tied in with the conspiritualists. But I think this is kind of a wedge issue within that community. And I haven't done the research. I don't know for sure. But I mean, and it makes sense from an evangelical that this would be their number one issue. If you truly thought, if I truly believed that a fertilized egg was the same as a human being, and I don't, but if I really thought that that was a human being and that taking Plan B or getting a abortion 4 weeks in or 5 weeks in is the same as going and shooting a baby in the head, I too would be there at the barricades. I too would be doing everything I could. I too would be holding my nose and voting for the Tangerine Dream, knowing that he's a terrible person, but he promised to do this one thing that I care about. So it unless you've spent time in the Christian evangelical movement, which I have, it's hard to overstate how important that one issue is.
Yes, yeah, that is where the term single issue voting comes from, is from that space. But I did say crickets. I was partly wrong on that because the way that people deflected, and I saw this both on the right and in conspiritual spaces, was by saying, oh, you wanted your choice when it came to your vaccine. You wanted to tell me what to do with my body with the vaccine, but now you want your choice.
Okay, well, address that. That's a criticism I've heard. I think it's a false equality or false equivalence. But why is it? Okay, Derek, you wanted me to have a vaccine to go travel or keep my job, but now you want the woman to have the choice to kill the baby within her. Why isn't this equivalent?
I'm going to answer it in a slightly parallel way, because I think that my problem I identified with Bill Maher comes out perfectly on last week's show. He ended the show talking about obesity, which is a big topic for him. Now, again, coming from the space I do, I agree with him on some of the things, but I don't agree with all of it, because he looks at the most extreme science on it, which is often sometimes wrong. But he's essentially making a public health argument. He's saying that obesity drives up insurance costs and is just bad for society in a number of ways. He started it by talking about how enrollment in military is at an all-time low because a lot of the candidates are overweight. So that's where he started it. So in so many ways, he's making a public health argument. But then when he goes to vaccine, he makes it a personal choice, a sovereignty argument. But it's a public health argument by nature. I don't know how people could have been clearer on that from the whole thing. If you have a healthy immune system, amazing, congratulations. This is a collective action that we need right now. Abortion is not that. I mean, you can go to the furthest reaches and then say it's public health in that we need population increase, which I would argue against.
Thank you, Elon Musk, because that was his argument.
Yes. So that you can go there, but then we have to have the talk about resource management, supply chain management, and what we're doing to the earth right now. So that argument falls flat to me. So if you're talking about raising a family or having a family, you have children, I decide not to have children. We can hang out, like we can talk about these things. But with vaccines, it's a different quality of argument because you're talking about public health. It was never about the individual right. And also, I don't know anyone, I'm sure there are some people, I'm not going to lie, but in my circles and all the pro-vaccine people I know, none of us were ever for mandates saying you have to get it. We were just being like, have some common sense.
I kind of was within the public, within the doctors, nurses, police, fire.
Okay.
Yeah. Within that sphere, you have to get it. That's the only thing I ever advocated for, because you're going into people's houses, you're coming into their lives at the worst moments. And especially at the time, the vaccines did a very decent job of preventing transmission.
I agree with that. And I agree with that too. Yeah. So because I think employer-based requirements are fine. I'm talking about just a general blanket rule where you have to, like...
On my drive down to Portland, there's a giant billboard on the highway saying, I don't know, people didn't fight and die in World War II so that you could present your papers at the supermarket. So that encapsulates this argument that, if you let these... it's just a tip of the wedge, right? If you make firefighters and cops and paramedics get vaccinated, then before you know it, they're going to be coming for your papers, and then there'll be no one left to speak for you.
Yeah, which is what I said before about the arguments just get ludicrous. Like, we're not focused on the real problems here. So to get back to your earlier question about like where this is going, one possible avenue that I've identified, we did a whole episode that Vice News covered when we broke this story, was about the Austin compound, which is this a few acres of land that was purchased on Lake Travis by some people in that Austin crew. At the announcement party, I had some video of it. Aubrey Marcus was there, but he wasn't leading it. It was Mickey Willis was involved, and this guy named Joyce Hart, who apparently owns the land or is part of that, people who have bought it. And they are creating... you can either buy a place to live there, or it's a retreat center that has a helicopter flying from Austin Airport directly there, and is reported from that night to have 4 full-time 24-hour surveillance armed guards. Tim Kennedy's involved in this circuit too. Of course. So there's that aspect. And it was being billed as a medical freedom community, which means you can live there and not have vaccines. Every neighborhood in North America is a medical freedom community then. Another crossover that you have with conspirituality and right wing, especially the Christian side, is this move toward homeschooling or small schools where it's all the medical freedom idea that is happening now. So we could watch polio run amok in these communities. And so that is, and there was also a similar commune that I don't know how it's progressed, but Pete Evans was involved with in Australia. That was a very similar ideology that was happening. So that is, I expect more of that. I expect more communities to pop up that are billed as such and that people gravitate towards. So we have an even greater bifurcation of ideologies in America.
So essentially right-wing communes.
Yeah.
To return to the analogy of the 60s, we're back again.
Yes.
Hippies with way more guns and helicopters.
And more money. Yeah.
Okay. We've pimped the podcast that you do with Mathew and Julian numerous times. I've promoted it on every medium I have. Conspirituality Podcast. You said you've also got some books coming out in the near future, long future?
So June 2023, we have Conspirituality, which is a book that was bought by Public Affairs globally and Random House in Canada. And that will be coming out in June 2023. That is really about the history of conspirituality. And then we've identified 10 or 12 influencers and did deep dives into them and showed their techniques, showed how this is a recurrence and it's based in body fascism and where it comes from, and then bringing it up to the modern era, and also make our predictions at the end. And sort of, again, being in the wellness community, there's certain aspects we love about it. So we end up being like, there are things that are great about this, but there are real troubles, and here they are. So yeah, that'll come out next June. And then I have my own book that I've just started sketching, so that's down the line.
Okay. And how do people follow you on social?
Derek Beres on Twitter, and then my Substack is also, it's called Trickle Down Wellness, which will be the name of my next book. And those are the two main places that I'm at. And then Conspirituality on Instagram is where we mostly have our traffic in terms of people having conversations. All of the non-podcast media we make goes to Instagram there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure. It's been a pleasure as always.
In real life.